The following is an EWTN special presentation.
Nice and high now for a tall man. Well, it is now my pleasure to introduce to you that tall man, John Garvey, who's the sitting president of Catholic University of America. I think many of you know him already from his fine work here. I mean, obviously, he's getting a reputation as an excellent executive and administrator. He is an expert in constitutional law, a world-renowned expert, particularly in the area of religious liberty and the First Amendment. He's written many articles and books on this subject, and I've used many of those articles in my own writings. I have to say, too, that he was, prior to this, dean of the Boston College Law School for 13 years, in which he earned a tremendous reputation as an administrator and also as a scholar and academic in law. He's going to be speaking to us today about teaching virtue, certainly the nexus of faith and reason. John, would you please come up? Thank you.
Thanks, Father. Can you all hear me? Is this mic good? Good. Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to you. I am now the president of the Catholic University of America, and I find myself thinking a lot about the issues of concern to higher education generally and Catholic higher education in particular. If you pay attention to those things, you will have noticed that in the course of the last year, the stuff that you read in the Journal, in the Times, in the Chronicle of Higher Education are all about issues concerning cost and affordability. You know, how can people, young people, afford to pay college tuition at a time when it's hard to get jobs when you graduate? What's the value of spending all this money on private education? And that's a thought that I give, or an issue that I give a lot of thought to myself, because we're a private university, and why should people send their kids to Catholic University rather than University of Maryland or the University of Kentucky, where I used to teach? I think it has a lot to do with the fact that people who send their sons and daughters to Catholic institutions of higher education are concerned about what sort of people they become over the course of their college careers. They're concerned about the fact that young people should be growing in wisdom, age, and grace during the time between when they're 18 and when they're 22 and graduate from college. And that's really a concern of the university to pay attention to the sorts of people it's forming, not just the information that it's imparting to them. Put it another way, it's part of our business model, part of our mission as the Catholic University of America to teach people virtue as well as physical chemistry or Mandarin Chinese. So I want to spend the time I have this morning talking about the problem of teaching virtue, and I'm going to approach it from a little ways back, but you'll see where I'm getting to. Last October, in one of the last significant acts of his papacy, Pope Benedict XVI named Hildegard of Bingen a doctor of the Church. That brought the number of doctors to 35, and it's a pretty impressive company: Augustine and Aquinas, Jerome and Anselm, Gregory the Great, John Chrysostom. I knew something about these. I knew next to nothing about Hildegard, so I undertook to find out a little more about her. Hildegard was probably born in 1098 in a little southwest of Frankfurt, and she was the 10th child in her family. And at the age of 8, she was turned over to the care of an older nun, Jutta of Spanheim. some think as a kind of tithe, a gift of the 10th child to the church. Jutta was an anchoress. She lived in an enclosure in Disibodenberg. And in joining Jutta, Hildegard was set on a fairly radical path. An anchoress has little engagement with the world. They were attached to the monastery. The home would have been very sparse. It would have been furnished with a window that looked out on the monastery so that she could participate in the prayers of the monks. And there was a hole, or a sort of hatch through which she could receive necessities. So this is where Hildegard lived for about 30 years. Jutta taught her the Latin Bible, taught her how to write and how to chant the office. There was a monk there, Fulmer of St. Disibod, who was about her age and later became her secretary, and he may have taught her musical notation. So for about 30 years, Hildegard lived this way, and when Jutta died in 1136, Hildegard became the abbess of this monastery. In the memoirs that she writes, Hildegard explains that she began to have visions as a child. She talked to Jutta about them and later to Fulmer, and in 1141 she began to write them down. She wrote a book, Scido Vias Domini, Know the Ways of the Lord, usually called by the short form Scivias. It's the best known account of the visions, and it took her about 10 years to write. Hearing about Hildegard at a synod that he was attending near Trier in 1147, 1148, in that winter, Pope Eugene III ordered a commission to look into the validity of her visions. And following the commission's recommendation, the Pope granted approval to her visions and encouraged her to make them known. In her 60s and 70s, Hildegard wrote 2 other visionary works, one the Book of Life's Merits, and another book called the Book of Divine Works. So these are the 3 pieces for which she's best known. But in addition to those, Hildegard wrote on philosophy and natural science and on medicine based on stuff that she'd learned in tending to the sick. She composed music for liturgical celebrations, and she wrote a morality play. I want to say something about this book, the Scivias. It's a pretty big volume, and it's about this fat. It's still in print. It's divided into 3 books about creation and redemption and sanctification. And each of the books is further subdivided into sections which describe Hildegard's visions, and then they explain the allegorical meaning of the visions. It's pretty well organized, so you don't get lost. But I found that I had a hard time connecting with the text. Maybe it was because we've lived 900 years apart. Maybe it was because she was a German and wrote in Latin and I'm an American. Or maybe because she lived her whole life in a cloister and never watched TV or drove a car or read Stephen Hawking, because she had a whole different way of different philosophical and scientific and artistic frames of reference. That we didn't use perspective in paintings until the 14th century. So she uses different metaphors and symbols and conventions and so on. And I'll quote from it in a minute. Here's an example of what I mean. Book 3 is an elaborate description and then explanation of a great 4-sided building, 150 feet by 75 feet. She speaks about cubits, not feet, but this building is, she says, the edifice of salvation, and its parts represent and explain the history of salvation and the virtues requisite for us to be saved. Let me read a description. The building had one wall around it, but made of 2 materials. One was a shining light, like the light of the sky, and the other was stones joined together. These 2 materials, she says, met at the east and north corners, so that the shining part of the wall went uninterruptedly from the east corner to the north corner, and the stone part went from the north corner around the west and south corners and ended in the east corner. The east side of the building, she says, represents the Son of God, who is the true Orient. And The light from which the east wall is built is the knowledge of good and evil. Reflective, she says, because it's like a mirror. She goes on to say, it shines like daylight, because when God graciously does his most splendid work in humans and they avoid evil, the good they accomplish is as bright in them as the day. In these 13 visions in Book 3, Hildegard goes on to describe and explain the features of this building. In Vision 8, for example, she talks about, she shows, there were pictures that accompanied these, probably drawn by somebody under her direction. She shows in detail a pillar with all of the virtues represented by women, ascending and descending. Here's one. The second figure, she says, was a deep sky blue, like a hyacinth, both in person and in tunic. Into her tunic, 2 stripes were marvelously woven and incomparably adorned with gold and gems, so that one stripe descended to the figure's feet over each shoulder in both front and back. This figure, she says, designates charity, which enlightens us as a hyacinth illumines any object on which it's put down. The stripes are the 2 commandments of charity, which are adorned by just works as if by bright gems. Here's another one. The virtue of chastity is pictured in Book 2 in a similar way. Here's what she says about it. In this brightness appeared a most beautiful image of a maiden with bare head and black hair, wearing a red tunic which flowed down about her feet. And again I heard the voice from on high saying, these are the daughters of Zion, and with them the harps of the harpers, and all sorts of musical instruments, and the voice of all gladness, and the joy of joys. She goes on to explain, this is serene virginity. The red tunic symbolizes those who have shed their blood for love of virginity, or in radiant humility preserved their virginity for the sake of Christ, and died sweetly in peace. For she was betrothed to the Son of God, and bore him a noble brood, the elect choir of virgins. Hildegard's lyrical vision of virginity and the joy of her virgins, the joy that these virgins take in singing hymns of praise, were probably written with her monastic life in mind. She was, remember, the abbess of this abbey, never went outside. There were young women whom she was forming the way Jutta of Spanheim had formed her. And for her, Hildegard, this was a pleasing commitment, one that she contrasts with what she calls the harsh and hard law of Moses. She calls St. Benedict, who the founder of her order, a second Moses. And he, she says, by the sweetness of the Holy Spirit's inspiration, made the plan of this order a separate and level path. I apologize, it's a little hard to follow the prose description of such an elaborate picture. I found it myself in reading the book. The level of detail can be tiresome. Hildegard often layers metaphor on metaphor, making it difficult to keep track of where she's been and where she's going. Fortunately, as I said, there are pictures, probably by somebody under her supervision, that adhere closely to the text of the visions. Then there is her praise of music made by the daughters of Zion. This is not a metaphor. She herself was a gifted composer. She wrote things that her sisters would have sung at Mass, as the sisters sang at Mass this morning, and during the Liturgy of the Hours. The Scivias itself, this fat volume I've been quoting from, ends with a vision entitled The Symphony of the Blessed, 7 antiphon and 7 responsories that are sung to the Blessed Mother, the angels, and the saints. And just as the pictures illustrate the text of the Scivias, so too does Hildegard's music join with it in one coherent whole. She says that the words symbolize the body and the jubilant music indicates the spirit. There isn't any notation in the manuscript, but you can get an idea of how the music sounds. There are recordings available. The pieces from the Symphony of the Blessed, for example, are incorporated in the Symphonia, and it's available on CD. In fact, our School of Music at Catholic has performed some of this music. Now, I have to confess that I have a problem relating to it that's not unlike my problem with Hildegard's prose. I recognize the notes as I recognize the words in her writings, but the musical lines are foreign. It's simple plain chant. Sometimes there's a single note of harmony underneath. The melody seems to wander. My musical friends tell me that this is because we're used to a framework that uses a diatonic scale and orders things around tonic and dominant and subdominant chords, so we know, or we can anticipate where the music's going and when it's going to get resolved. You know when a refrain is coming to an end. Hildegard is, for me, though maybe not for her contemporaries, a little harder to predict in this way. And the rhythm of the music is a little hard to follow, too. It seems to track the accents and syllables of the words rather than the kind of meter and tempo that we're used to regulating each section of the piece. There aren't time signatures, there aren't measures, 4/4 time with four beats in a measure. It differs from the music that we're used to in the way that free verse, April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, the way free verse differs from poems that have meter. This is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks, that sort of thing. So I don't mean to imply that Hildegard's art and music were deficient somehow. I just mean to say that I had trouble connecting with her way of presenting things. I wrote it off as a result of really big differences in language and culture and experience. Then a really funny thing happened. About a week after I had finished reading the Scivias, I was reading the Sunday Times. In recent years, I've been really turned off by the kind of hedonistic appeals that I see in the New York papers. The Times often runs a section on food that makes me feel like I'm doing something dirty if I, prepare or eat one of their recipes. Last year, the issue that I'm talking about, they ran a separate section. Sometimes there's in addition to the magazine, there'll be a pull-out section on education, or this one was on watches. I'm not making this up. On watches, and each page there were these watches that cost more than your car, certainly more than my car. One was made by Bulgari, the jeweler in New York. It observed this: Bulgari bedecks its famous Serpenti watch with a host of diamonds and gemstones for breathtaking beauty, and a watch that coils around the wrist in all of its colorful glory. I found myself thinking about Hildegard's tunic with the hyacinth color, incomparably adorned with gold and gems. Except that for Hildegard, the beautiful object that she was describing had a deeper meaning. It was a symbol of charity. The gems, in her vision, represent just works. The Bulgari watch that the Times so admired is what it is. It was a purely material object that the reader was invited to ogle, and if she was rich enough, to own. I'm almost tempted to observe that there is a deeper meaning, and it's just the inverse of Hildegard. The watch, the ad says, coils around the wrist in all its colorful glory. It is the Serpenti watch, and what the advertiser are promoting is the serpent that beguiled Eve. Maybe that's a little too imaginative, but speaking of Eve and the serpent, I noticed in the same issue, I was reading the book review section in the same, and I always look to see what is new in nonfiction or fiction. I noticed that the 3 best-selling books on the Times' paperback trade fiction list around the time were E.L. James's 50 Shades of Grey and its sequels. These books, I hope you haven't read them, offer an interesting contrast to Hildegard's vision. James's first book, the bestseller, is also the tale of a virgin, in this case committed to a man named Christian. Grey is his last name. Unlike Hildegard's serene virginity, James's heroine enthusiastically throws herself into a sexual relationship of bondage and discipline with her billionaire boyfriend. The plan of their relationship is in form, though certainly not in content, more like the harsh and hard law of Moses than the level path designed by Benedict for Hildegard's order. Here is how chapter 5 of the Rule of St. Benedict begins. The first step of humility, Benedict says, is unhesitating obedience, which comes naturally to those who cherish Christ above all, because of the holy service they have professed, or because of dread of hell and for the glory of everlasting life. They carry out the superior's order as promptly as if the command came from God himself. James's heroine takes the first step in her relationship with this billionaire by agreeing in writing to a different set of rules that will govern their sexual relationship. I quote the contract that she signs: obedience. The submissive will obey any instructions given by the dominant immediately without hesitation or reservation. The submissive will agree to any sexual activity deemed fit and pleasurable by the dominant. I gave up on the novel at this point. I began to feel as though I might actually understand Hildegard better than I do a lot of my contemporaries. I can't get exact numbers, but several accounts I've read report that James's book sold 40 million copies in a matter of months. Then, a week later, the Times again, I read in the real estate section about a penthouse at 55 Central Park West that was up for sale. This, I don't know whether it's sold yet, I haven't checked, but last fall it was up for $35 million. It used to belong to Calvin Klein. Mike Nichols and Diane Sawyer once tried to buy it, but they didn't offer enough. It had a huge glassed-in pavilion facing the east terrace, looking out on Central Park. The building was a 1930s building, and the ad said it had a gradient earth-toned facade to give the impression the sun is always shining on it. The current owner, the ad went on to say, has been using the vacant penthouse as an occasional party zone. Once again, I found myself thinking about Hildegard. This time, her building made of two materials. One, once again, on the east side, was a shining light like the light of the sky, and the other was stones joined together. But Hildegard's building is the edifice of salvation, not an occasional party zone. Both Hildegard's book, The Scivias, and The Times are making an appeal, though they're selling different visions of the good life. Each invites us to think about something alluring. It was at first surprising to me that the things were so much alike: clothes and jewels and sex and palaces. Then again, maybe it shouldn't be. The palace of Knossos on Crete dates back to the Bronze Age. Archaeologists have found jewelry in Morocco that's more than 80,000 years old. Sex is as old as Adam and Eve. The important difference is that for Hildegard, beautiful things are not ends in themselves. They light the way to God. Gold and gems and marvelously woven cloth help us to picture the appeal of charity in her vision. A palace whose wall is shining like the light of the sky points, she says, toward the Son of God, who is the true Orient. The account of serene virginity is most revealing of all. The most beautiful image of a maiden with bare head and black hair wearing a red tunic is not presented to the reader as an object to be taken and enjoyed, as she might be in contemporary fiction. Quite the contrary. Her beauty is something she offers to God. As Hildegard says, for the perfection that flowers in the state of virginity directs its strength not downward toward earthly things, but miraculously upward to what is in heaven. I never imagined I'd say this, but I think my subscription to the New York Times has helped me grasp what Hildegard was up to and why Benedict thought so well of her. I have to confess that although she has a certain aesthetic appeal, like blank verse or Gregorian chant. It's not one that grabs me. Still, thinking about the Scivias illuminates a big issue in contemporary ethics for me, as someone who cares a lot about what's happening in Catholic culture, and especially in Catholic higher education. So let me say now a word about that, about how we're accustomed to teach these things, and how I wish we maybe ought to do it. Teaching morality is out of fashion in higher education. When academics do think about ethics, and they have courses in them in their professional schools or in some corners of philosophy and theology, they have a tendency to frame questions about ethical dilemmas. This comes naturally to law professors like I used to be. We've taught our subject by the case method since the latter part of the 19th century. The idea is that law, the common law anyway, is made synthetically by the accretion of thousands of individual difficult decisions, and studying them one by one helps us to understand the underlying principles. This case method has spread from law schools to business schools in the 20th century. There are important differences, but both focus on the resolution of dilemmas at the retail level as the way of teaching. In our schools of philosophy and theology, we find that faculty get drawn into this way of thinking. And you can see the appeal of it as a heuristic device. It engages students' attention. It stimulates discussion. Here's an example. We have a moral principle: it's wrong to tell a lie. So suppose Aunt Frank is hiding in my attic and the Nazis come and they're looking for her and knock on the door. Anybody up here? They ask me whether she's up there. How should I answer if it's wrong to tell a lie? Or think about Philippa Foot's famous trolley problem. It goes like this. Suppose X is the driver of a runaway tram, which he can only steer from one narrow track onto another, and 5 men are working on one track and 1 man on the other. Anyone on the track he enters is bound to be killed. Which way should he steer? That's one well-known philosopher, ethicist, calls this way of thinking a morality of obligation, with its focus on what we must and must not do. It is important to get the right answers to these dilemmas. I don't mean to say that there aren't right answers or that this is a trivial matter. We are obliged to act morally when ethical questions present themselves, and sometimes we need to think hard to get them. But, and this is my point, this is no way to get people to embrace the Christian message. It's kind of like I've said, teaching someone the game of golf and saying, okay, well now here's the really important thing. You need to keep your ball inbounds or you'll have to re-tee at a 2-stroke penalty, and you got to avoid lateral hazards and sand traps and stay out of the rough. Of course, you should do all of these things, but staying out of these things is not the point of the game. The point of the game is to get the ball in the hole with as few strokes as possible, and the road to that lies along the fairways and greens. What I want to say is that this is the approach that we need to take toward teaching virtue. Benedict XVI once observed this, that the only really effective apologia for Christianity comes down to 2 arguments, namely, the saints the Church has produced and the art which has grown in her womb. I was really struck by that because it conformed to what my wife and I had done as parents. When we were raising our children, we focused on the saints, not on the art. But of course, there was a lot of case-by-case instruction, about lies and selfishness and fighting and sex, and about sharing and consideration and so on. There were standard penalties for curfew violations and more imaginative ones for more severe violations. But alongside all of this, the morality of obligation, the rule enforcement, alongside this, we would begin every day following the example of my Aunt Jane, who, in raising her kids, read every morning over breakfast the lives of the saints. So this was my job in the morning. This wasn't about the morality of obligation. It was about making something beautiful for God, as Malcolm Muggeridge put it. Over breakfast, we'd read about some saint whose feast it was. Some of these, like Hildegard, were hard to identify with. For me, the Desert Fathers, or those Irish guys who lived in the little rocky huts on the cliffs above the Atlantic, were. But I think that was not the approach to holiness that I was called to. There were others that appealed strongly to me when I was a child, and I hope they or some others would have a similar appeal for our kids. When I was little, St. Tarcisius was a particular favorite of mine, and it had everything to do with his being a martyr. I often wondered in my dreams of youthful adventure whether I'd have the stuff to hold on to my faith in the face of persecution. I hoped so, but I wasn't at all sure. I'm still not. But hearing that young people about my age had done it made plausible my ambition of heroic sanctity. Of course, I was never really clear about where the persecution was going to come from. There wasn't much in my small town in Pennsylvania. But kids know that there are dangers out there in places they haven't explored, so I never got too specific about that. And anyway, I did know at that time that Russia, for whose conversion we prayed every Sunday after Mass, was godless and malevolent and powerful, and maybe they were going to come to Sharon and persecute us and require that we renounce our faith. So I would dream about Tarcisius. And there were others that I found attractive too, and who I hoped would appeal to our children as well. St. Francis was a particular favorite of mine and our daughter Becky's for his embrace of holy poverty. St. Damien for his charity toward lepers. I had a special fondness for the founders and members of missionary orders. No doubt I shared with them a spirit of adventure. It was nice to be able to dream that I could serve God while still or by exploring sub-Saharan Africa or East Asia. I might be giving myself too much credit, but I think that what drew me to these saints in the first place was that they lived lives of virtue. That's why I looked on them rather than on Balboa or Edmund Hillary. But also, it had to be the kind of virtuous life that appealed to me, and that's why I looked to them rather than St. Jerome or St. Ambrose or Robert Bellarmine. They were the kind of guys I had in mind. Anyway, our ambition in reading stories like these to the children was to inspire them to want to be holy. And the takeaway from the breakfast table was not, so St. Tarcisius didn't break any rules, he got a perfect score, and had little to confess on Saturdays. It was instead, what a great life that was. What a way to go down. How pleasing to God and how admirable. I doubt that I have the stuff that saints are made of, but I would sure like to try. Benedict's aphorism speaks of two methods of persuasion, examples of holiness, the saints, which was our preferred method, and he says models of beauty. My wife and I chose the first. Hildegard chose the second, but the two are not so very different. We read from the lives of the saints at breakfast. Hildegard probably read from the Scivias to her nuns at meals. Both exercises were designed to promote the life of Christian virtue by showing evidence of its appeal. The likeness may actually run deeper than that. I don't want to overstate my case and argue that the books that I read over breakfast were great literature. I inherited this 4-volume Butler's Lives of the Saints from my grandpa, and it tended toward hagiography. But to the juvenile mind, I speak now of my own, the most alluring tales of holiness had something in common with Robert Louis Stevenson, or better yet, with C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. These two parts of Benedict's aphorism, beauty and holiness, may be connected as form and content. Holiness, the life of virtue, is the content of the message we're trying to communicate. We sell it more effectively if we can make it appear beautiful. Conversely, when Benedict XVI talks of the art which has grown in her womb, he does not mean the meretricious appeals of beauty we see in the work of Jeff Koons or the photographs of Nan Goldin. He means art inspired by the same grace that makes us holy. I don't mean to say that all beautiful art has got to be about religious themes like Handel's Messiah or Dante's Divine Comedy or Michelangelo's David. I do believe, though, that there is a necessary connection between goodness and beauty. It's not a coincidence that we use the word grace to describe both the indwelling of the Holy Spirit and the beauty of a painting or dance or sculpture or architectural structure. For Christians, the connection is natural. The incarnation means, for us, that God has sanctified our flesh and the world we live in by making them his own. So our senses can approach him in ways that our minds may not. This is why the sacraments use outward signs. And the true artist is able to perceive and to communicate that grace in her art. Okay, so now let me come to the punchline, and this is a really radical idea. In higher education today, and in popular culture, in the media, in the pronouncements of our government leaders, we see a lack of attention to, maybe even an agnosticism about the idea of virtue. University presidents and big city newspapers and candidates for governor will all say, look, it's not really my business to meddle in the private lives of my constituents or my opponent. They may go farther and say that what's right and good for me isn't necessarily so for everyone. I have argued elsewhere that why I think this is wrong, and I won't repeat those arguments here, but instead I want to make a different point. I think, and this is my punchline, that the decline of virtue that I speak of is due, at least in part, to bad art. Now, I know you're thinking I really lost my grip. Or maybe more charitably, that I'm making the kind of claim that only an academic would propose. But I really mean it, and give me a chance to close by explaining. My argument is actually pretty straightforward. We teach virtue by showing examples, so people will know what it is, the lives of the saints, and by exposing people to its appeal. Here's where beauty comes in, so that they're drawn to it. If we can't show the beauty of charity and chastity and fortitude and temperance, we have lost the argument for the importance of virtue. I now realize that that's what Hildegard was about, and her appeal was no doubt well suited to her audience of 12th century Benedictines. But how about us? Hans Urs von Balthasar, one of Benedict's favorite theologians, has argued that the world has lost a sense of beauty. Here's what he says. He continues, in a world without beauty, the good also loses its attractiveness, the self-evidence of why it must be carried out. Man stands before the good and asks himself why it must be done, and not rather its alternative, evil. For this too is a possibility, and even the more exciting one. Why not investigate Satan's depths? In a world that no longer has enough confidence in itself to affirm the beautiful, the proofs of the truth have lost their cogency. Had von Balthasar lived for another decade, he might have had particularly strong evidence to back up his claim. I remember in the late 90s, there was an aptly titled art exhibit called Sensation that toured London and Berlin and came to Brooklyn, made kind of a splash there. It featured artists like Damien Hirst, whose 1,000 Years, one of his pieces, displayed a severed cow's head and maggots and flies. Another of his featured works was composed of two halves of a pig carcass cut down the middle, nose to tail, and suspended in a container of formaldehyde. I just saw this in London a month ago. It's still around. Mark Quinn contributed a piece called Self, which was a bust made out of 9 pints of his own frozen blood. The one that had Christians particularly upset was Chris O'Feely's The Holy Virgin Mary, a black Madonna covered with dung and adorned with pornographic images. Sensation delivered on his name. Defenders of the exhibit, and they were legion among the artistic crowd, they argued that sometimes art must shock. No doubt this is true. I remember reading when I was in college about, I'm a fan of Stravinsky, and Stravinsky's Rite of Spring was so shocking in its premiere performance, with that really high oboe beginning, that there was a riot. But shock wasn't itself the purpose. It was part of the technique. But sensation, by contrast, never really delivered a message beyond the shocking content. It's uncompromisingly dark themes snuffed out any ray of hope or possibility of meaning. Von Balthasar's reference to the exploration of Satan's depths may not have been far off the mark. The philosopher Roger Scruton calls this kind of art the art of desecration. Its purpose, he says, is diametrically opposed to what Benedict describes as the true purpose of art. Here is what Benedict says. The purpose of art is to open the door to the infinite, to a beauty and a truth that goes beyond the ordinary. Open the eyes of the mind and the heart, or inspire an intimate emotion, a sense of joy that's to have clearly perceived that in front of you there was not only matter, a piece of marble or bronze, a painted canvas, a series of letters, or a combination of sounds, but something bigger, something that speaks, capable of touching the heart, of communicating a message, elevating the soul. Of course, not all bad art or architecture, music, drama, literature is shocking. Much of it's bad for other reasons. Consider the modern architecture associated with the Bauhaus school. Its proponents, Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, weren't shocking, quite the contrary. Their aesthetic is efficient and utilitarian. There is a kind of cold rationality to their designs that did away with embellishment and ornamentation and historical reference and any homage to ancient tradition. It's not shocking, but they failed to elevate the soul. They're to open a door to the infinite, to speak to beholders about some higher meaning or presence, even in the way that Hildegard's buildings, as she described them, did. The beauty of the Bauhaus school is almost savagely limited. Rather than opening up vistas, Bauhaus architecture kind of left us feeling cold and empty. You might object that these artists, the Bauhaus school, the artists of sensation, were not Christian, and so they weren't. They don't aim for the Christian version of beauty of which von Balthasar or Benedict XVI spoke. That's certainly true, but neither did non-Christian artists of the past. Homer was no Christian, nor was Sophocles. The Mona Lisa is not an explicitly Christian work, nor is Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. But the works didn't exhibit the same defeatist attitude toward beauty that our contemporary art does. I should say that Christian art has not escaped the lost sense of beauty. In our own church, the Catholic Church, beauty eludes much of contemporary art, music, and architecture. Our commencement speaker this year was a poet, one of my favorite American poets, Dana Gioia. And Dana has this to say about the Catholic Church: the loss of a vital aesthetic sensibility in the church has weakened the church's identity in modern society and limited the ways in which it speaks to the world. The graceless architecture of most new churches, the banal and formulaic painting and sculpture, the mediocre music so indifferently performed, and the tone-deaf language of religious services reveal a Catholic Church that has not only cut itself off from culture, but also lost touch with its own great traditions of fostering beauty and creativity. This is maybe nowhere truer, this loss of aesthetic sensibility than in liturgical music. This is, mind you, the church that brought to the world sacred works by people like Bruckner and Messiaen and Duruflé. Today we celebrate Mass with music that doesn't pass muster by the standards of the most mediocre popular folk. The St. Louis hymnal, written largely by musically untrained Jesuit seminarians in the 1970s, comprises the standard repertoire for liturgies today. Young Catholics, our children, have grown up expressing their highest religious sentiment to the drippy lyrics and chords of One Bread, One Body, and Here I Am, Lord, while the music of Bach and Handel and Fauré sound to them complicated and overblown. Gregorian chant, once the backbone of Catholic liturgical tradition, almost never gets a hearing. It's no wonder nobody comes to church for the music anymore. So we have a crisis in art that is twofold. On one front, much of our serious music and art has become indefatigably dark. On the other, we've traded the rich tradition of high art for infantile expressions of base sentiments. Roger Scruton, whom I referred to earlier, sums it up by saying this: we seem to be caught between two forms of sacrilege, the one dealing in sugary dreams, the other in savage fantasies. Both are forms of falsehood, ways of reducing and demeaning our humanity. Both involve a retreat from the higher life and a rejection of its principal sign, which is beauty. Neither the profane art of the sensation exhibit nor the saccharine tunes of the St. Louis hymnal imagine that human beings are capable of something really beautiful. And here we begin to see why Hildegard links beauty and virtue. Beauty orients us to something higher. When we enjoy beauty, it's a reflection of what we value, what we hope for, what we aspire to. Bach's Mass in B minor expresses divine mercy and patience, justice and charity. We take pleasure in the Mass to the extent that we believe and we value the virtues that it expresses. At the same time, hearing the Mass deepens and renews our appreciation of the virtue and our commitment to making a place for them in our own behavior. Beauty, Roger Scruton says, is vanishing from our world because we live as though it didn't matter. And we live that way because we've lost the habit of sacrifice and are striving always to avoid it. Beauty is an aspiration. It's an expression of what, with God's grace, we hope to be. Hildegard saw that, and so should we in our teaching of virtue. Well, thank you for your patience in listening to me for so long.
That was absolutely profound. Thank you so much. Thank you very, very, very much.
I sure appreciate it.
Stay up on the stage for just 1 minute if you would, but I just want to give... Thank you very, very much, John Garvey. I think it was absolutely a profound presentation. I'm going to relabel him the master of understated humor, understated wisdom, but the master truly of faith shining through beauty, the beauty of the Creator, the beauty of the good, the beauty of the love of Christ, the beauty of heroic sanctity, and the beauty of sanctity itself. It was a really tremendous, deep, profound presentation, giving us an insight into this. Thank you so much. We just have a quick little surprise here. John was going to receive our award at this evening's banquet. Unfortunately, he has to get on a plane back to D.C., so Tim Bush is going to present that award to him right now. Thank you.
Okay, why don't you hold that, Father?
Oh, sure.
For a second.
You bet.
Okay, as you know, the Napa Institute has 2 awards. We'll give the second one out tonight. But I sit on the board of Catholic University of America, which brought my attention to John Garvey. I've worked with him for the last couple of years. He has been a scholar teaching in law schools at Michigan, Notre Dame, Boston College, recently the dean of the Boston College Law School. And he's done a number of writings, not the least of which I think that made a huge change at Catholic U was where he converted all of the dorms over a 4-year period from co-ed dorms, which they had been for 30 years, 2 same-sex dorms, so he did that over a period of 4 years. And in addition, is bringing priests and religious sisters into the respective dorms, and he and I are working on a project to bring chapels into the dorms. How foreign of an idea to Catholic University of America. So today, I would like to give the Reason and Faith Award is in the name of Father Spitzer to John for all of his work over his lifetime in all the universities and in the public domain. And we have a plaque, but we also, given it's Napa, we give him a bottle of wine as well. So, very drinkable.